Hi everyone, this is Dr. Madhuparna Roychoudhury. I teach in the Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture, University of Calcutta. And my basic research was on the making of museums in colonial India. As we are under a complete lockdown and home quarantine, this endeavor of the Indian Museum is truly amazing. Through their online program, Stories of World Cultures, people will get to know so many unknown folds of our cultural heritage. So stay home, stay safe, and we'll fight this out together. Today, I would like to share with you some of the larger questions surrounding the writing of museum history and also the procedures and techniques I had to adopt while doing my research and later on a book on the museum history in the colonial context India. Now, as we all know, museum studies in recent years have emerged as an important aspect on the scholarly studies of heritage. And heritage is, however, is a much more open-ended terrain structured by diverse sites of memory and which in turn are capable of diverse interpretations, meanings and readings. Museums, I think, is more centrally preoccupied with the question of the preservation of varied kinds of memories, which include, the development of scientific knowledge on the one hand, and on the other hand, it might include varied things like, for example, archaeological knowledge, art historical knowledge, representation of daily life in the form of ethnological objects, and so on and so forth. And, being a historian of museum studies, I had to engage with several such questions which arise from the interconnections that I had been talking about. Now, in the first place, I think that the history of museums was comparatively largely an uncharted territory. And most of the researches on museum history in the earlier part of the 20th century were in the form of internal approaches, internal histories, or we can say commemorative histories, which address the internal development of the institutions, accompanied by the development of a new cadre of museum officials. But for me, the more challenging task was to put this account in a proper contextualist frame in order to answer the questions connected with the whys and hows of the rise of the varied kinds of museums in a particular context. And in the first place, when I was trying to figure out the character of museum making in the colonial period, I found an overwhelming predominance of archaeological museums all over the country, and which I thought was a feature connected with the conservationist policies of the ASI, Archaeological Survey of India. And this was in any case the high period of Indian archaeology under the British colonial auspices. And we should mention the names of John Marshall and Lord Curzon, to whom we are indebted, and their conservationist policies to a large extent was responsible for the development of so many museums during this time all over the length and breadth of the country. And both of John Marshall and Curzon, they had a program of classification of the different archaeological museums in the different locations. And so around this time, we had the local museums and the site museums on the one hand, and on the other hand, we had the more important museums, or we can say the great museums in the important centers. Like, for example, the Indian Museum was paraded as the Imperial Museum. But in the early part of the 20th century, when the capital of India was shifted to Delhi, John Marshall came up with an elaborate plan of the foundation of an imperial museum. The project was never came through. It was never successful. But still, it can be looked at as a backdrop and forming the backdrop of the formation of the National Museum, which was established in the immediate aftermath of independence. So, I think museums should not be considered merely as an institution of public education. This is perhaps one reason why nationalism, regional sentiments, or even local sentiments, played an important role in the creation of varied kinds of museums in the early 20th century. I will give you some examples. One is the example from Ajmer Museum, which was created by the great nationalist historian and museum maker G.S. Ojha, Gauri-Shankar Hirachand Ojha, who tried to, actually talk about, establish the ancient glory of the Rajputs through the exhibits collected in the Ajmer Museum. On the other side of the spectrum, we have at Rajshahi, which is a northern district of undivided Bengal, the local literati coming up with the foundation of the Barendra Research Society Museum. What was the intention? The intention was to establish the history and heritage, celebrate the history and heritage of an ancient center of Pala rule. And coming to a completely different example, when we look at the Victoria Memorial, look at the history of the Victoria Memorial, and if we look at the planning of the Victoria Memorial in particular, we will see a completely different kind of an imperative. That was the celebration of the British rule at a time when it was in a kind of jeopardy. So what I want to say that from the contextualist approach, the politics of museum making remains as much important as the other more important preoccupation of public education. And this is, in any case, this is a kind of a modernist project which is inextricably linked with the rise and functioning of the public sphere. And this is one particular issue which I tried to address in my work. However, the more central issue in my book was archaeology. So what I want to say that this is an important matter which I wanted to address in my book. I don't know how far I was successful. But gathering information about the museum, that was also a very important, very strenuous thing for me at least, because I collected most of the materials from the office of the Director General of Archaeology in Delhi, and where unclassified files, loads of unclassified files were kept on the many dusty shelves. So I had to dig out information from them, and bits and pieces of information were coming for use in my book. But however, what I would like to say that the main approach in my book was to see the reason, to find the reason for the establishment of so many diverse kinds of museum by different classes of museum makers, and what was the imperative, or what were the imperatives and inspirations behind the making of such museums. This is one central question I tried to address. But the more complex question, or you can say the critical question, which was unanswered in my book, was the way the museum was received by or treated by the visitors or the public. This is one area which I could not address because of the lack of information available, and particularly the museums in India are somewhat different in the sense that there is not much written on the way the old galleries were replaced by the new ones, or how or why the exhibitions were taken place and with what motives. So we don't have much material on that. So this is an area which is still considered to be a fuzzy zone, and future research can be undertaken on this particular area. And for that, I think that future researchers have to look at the museum books and the documents and the visitors books, so that they can have an idea about the way the museum is leaving an impact on the visitor's mind, because till now this is a completely unknown territory on which we can't say much. But as I was telling you, this is a question I could not address in my book. That remains an important lacuna. And anyway, thank you for your patient hearing. Thanks a lot.